Hey guys, Warhammer here, and we're going to be talking about the content additions for Kislev in the Shadows of Change 2.8. I have read through this in its entirety, but I wanted to go through it kind of quickly and talk about some of the points I've highlighted that I think are the most important things to talk about. So we've previously talked about Cathay and Zinch, but during their last post, they said they would talk about when this is actually going to launch. And here they said they're excited to confirm that patch 4.2 will launch on Thursday, February 22nd. So that's less than a week away, which is really, really cool. I'm excited for this, and I think it'll be fun to get our hands on this. So before they actually start talking about any of the units, they kind of have a... I don't want to say a paragraph because it's actually several paragraphs, but basically talking about why some of the content additions for Kislev don't really line up with what we knew about Kislev previously before Total War Warhammer 3. And basically, the gist of what they're trying to say is that Games Workshop significantly changed Kislev's lore, and they have to follow that. They say, like, with many things in life, this meant some out with the old and in with the new. So a lot of the stuff that we do know about, like Kislev from the second edition role-playing game, has basically been thrown out the window for the most part. We are still going to get hag witches, or we're still getting hag witches, but Mother Ostankia is the only hag mother, so we're not going to get the generic lord of that, which they kind of talked about before. But said this new take, like with all other additions to Kislev, is what makes them exciting and brings them in line with other races in 8th edition and Games Workshop. They've said multiple times over the years that the trilogy of games are based on the 8th edition primarily, and they look to older editions when there's something they want to add. They kind of pick and choose, but primarily it's based on the 8th edition game. And Kislev and Cathay were written as if they were in 8th edition, even though they probably will come to Warhammer the Old World. So, another thing talking about Kislev, so in the old lore, there was a distinct separation between basically two different cultures, the Ungol's and the Gospodars. But right here, they say the distinct Ungol and Gospodar split within Kislev is something that is no longer at the forefront of Kislev lore. Instead, taking a backseat to allow us to tell new stories within the faction. So that's basically just Games Workshop saying, forget about that stuff, we want to show you the new stuff so we can sell you new models. But they said there won't be any more implemented into our game now or moving forward. So that's basically not going to exist, the distinct cultures anymore. It's all a unified nation now, which I think is a little bit disappointing in my mind, just because that was something that was kind of unique about Kislev, was the distinct cultures that are contrasting and supporting one another, but also are kind of infighting. So after they've talked about that, they just start to go into the Kislev edition. So first off, there is going to be a new lore of magic called the Lore of the Hag. 6 new spells like other lores, but something that's unique about the Lore of the Hag is that your normal versions of the spells will be hexes, so that's damaging enemy units, but when they overcast, there are buffs to your units. Yeah, and like I said here, the only hag mother in the current lore is told by Games Workshop as Mother Ostankia. So we talked about that before. So that's not something... Yeah, it's not something I'm a huge fan of, but we just kind of have to go with it. Talking about the spell lore in... talking about the hag mothers in particular, since they're no longer canon. Instead, they said they need to look for other generic lore options for Kislev, and they came up with a good option, talking with Games Workshop, called the Druzina. So even though... we'll talk about that a little bit later, actually, because we'll talk about the spell lore first. So, yeah, the Lore of the Hag will be available to Mother Ostankia and the Hag Witches. I'll be curious to see whether Mother Ostankia will get the full lore, or whether she's going to have a split lore, kind of like she did before. So the new lore attribute, basically, whenever you cast a spell, it decreases enemy leadership, and it will bless spell resistance for your units. I'm not going to look at these spells in their entirety, I'm just going to cover basically what they are. So the first one, the Forbidden Fence, is basically a hex that's going to like slow your opponents, slow their speed, and reduce some of their vigor, while the Overcast version will basically do the opposite of that. So you'll get faster units, more charge bonus, and gaining vigor. Oh, and it also gains Strider and Stoppable, which are actually pretty cool. Witch Brew, this is basically like a teardropped wind spell that applies poison. Its blessing basically does the same thing, but it actually heals when you overcast it, adds vigor, and makes them immune to contact effects, which is actually pretty cool. That way they're like no longer susceptible to poison or discouraged contact effects. Talking about the Curse of the Ancient Witch, this is another hex that reduces enemy block chance, armor. Oh, and actually, it actually spreads to nearby enemies. That's actually a really, really cool thing. So Nurgle has some spells like that, some abilities, I should say. So it's nice to see this mechanic come back to where abilities can spread to enemy units. But the Blessing version of the Overcast version imbues magical attacks, enhances armor-piercing missile damage, base missile damage, and reload skill. So it goes from a debuffed on enemies to reduce their susceptibility to range attacks, and when it's overcast, turns into a big missile buff. The next one, Vengeance of Spirits. This is going to be it's not quite a vortex. Maybe it kind of is. Looking at this, it's kind of hard to decide what it is. I think it's just going to be a stationary vortex, sort of like Pit of Shades. But damages enemies in a radius and applies the Silence attribute, which stops affected units from being able to use or cast spells. This is actually a new mechanic that we've never seen before. That actually can be really, really good, especially in like multiplayer, where you can just stop units from being able to use their abilities or spells. So that's pretty powerful. And the Blessing version of it enhances the flow of magic in favor of you or your ally spellcasters, dealing damage in the process. First Cauldron, this is just a damage spell. It's almost like, if you look at the animation, it's pretty similar to the Desolation of Asgore from the Chaos Dwarf lore, the lore of Hashit, where it almost erupts like a volcano and then has missiles that rain down on them. And this is, okay, they call this one a Static Vortex. So the other one's not quite a vortex, but this is pretty similar to it. When it's overcast, it doesn't cause any friendly fire damage. So basically, you just can throw it right on top of your units and not have to worry about hurting them. The last spell is called the Malediction of Madness, which reduces enemy damage, basically, and it also inflicts a rampage, which sometimes is a good effect, but sometimes it's not, because it keeps units fighting. If you can kind of use it, rampage is sometimes has a drawback, because units will keep fighting longer than they normally would, but then they don't accept any new orders. But for the Blessing version of it, basically just is a big melee damage buff, and then units that they attack suffer from rampage. So talking about the generic lord called the Druzina. So based on the description, it says the Druzina is a character steeped in Kislev lore, a lesser noble that lives beyond the walls of Kislev great cities and tends to his own lands and people. So basically, it's an Ungol lord, but they're not going to call it that because they've taken away the separation now. But it's basically an Ungol lord, in my opinion. Ever ready to serve the Tsars or Tsarina, the Druzina are well connected to the nature that surrounds them and brings with them to war items that have been handed down generation by generation. So they carry a great axe as their melee weapon, but they're also a hybrid unit like many of the Kislev, so they carry a bow. So continuing the hybrid theme that Kislev has for a lot of its units. Talking specifically about what they are going to do for the army, they increase range buffs for your units, and they are the only unit in Kislev that can replenish ammo. So they're going to kind of be your probably your hybrid lord, where you can do a lot of damage in melee, because the great weapons, you're going to be better at fighting armor compared to the boyars, who are double axes. But they'll also be good with ranged, so they have their bow and they'll buff range units. And then the legendary hero for Kislev, coming with Shadow of Change 2.0, is the Golden Knight. This is something we basically knew was going to happen anyway. Her artwork had been leaked, I think, with the release of Warhammer 3. So we knew she was going to come eventually. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the lore of the Golden Knight. Basically, she's just the most skilled, he or she. The current one is a she. But basically, they're just the toughest warrior in Kislev. And because of that, they get enchanted armor and an enchanted sword. And they're just, yeah, they get enchanted armor from the Cult of Urson, and then they have they get an enchanted sword from the Cult of Urson, and their armor is blessed by the spellcasters of Kislev. Here we can take a little look at their artwork. Which is funny, because this almost looks like a male model rather than a female one, but I guess it just, yeah, we can't change that a whole lot. But talking about her specifically, so the Golden Knight is a heavily armored guardian hero with a focus on protecting friendly characters and buffing the resolve of her comrades nearby. So it probably means that she's going to get the guardian trait, which just provides physical resistance. Maybe she'll get like a little increased version of that. That would be cool to have since she's your legendary hero. And then she also buffs the resolve of her comrades nearby. So I'm going to guess that's something sort of like Encourage, which already exists in the game, that just kind of provides a secondary leadership aura if your lord is killed. But I may be wrong on that one. So yeah, she's going to be wearing a full suit of armor and wielding the powerful magic sword, Urson's Claw. Talking about her abilities more detail, so the inspiration says that the more damage sustained by the Golden Knight, the more determined surrounding friendly units become to fight on. So as she takes more damage, she's going to increase her leadership buff units around her. She's a duelist, so that means primarily she's going to have a small splash area of effect on her weapons, and going to be more tuned to killing off characters. And then one of the 2 units being added for Kislev is called the Kislevite Warriors. These are halberd tier 1 units, and basically they fill the need that the Kislevites have in the early game. They don't really have an anti-large troop, so this will be a great addition for them. And it's tier 1. Some of the cool things talking about them is that they are going to have, just take a look at them real fast. They're not a hybrid unit, so they're going to have a lot more entities than a standard Kislevite infantry unit. So they're basically like a Kossar version of basically just a full melee Kossar unit. And they don't say exactly how many more entities they're going to have, but I think the Kossars have like 100 or 120, so these may be like 140, 160 in their infantry counts. They are anti-large with halberds, which is great, because halberds do more armor piercing than spears. Because like in the prologue, we have armored Kossars with spears, which for some reason they've never been added to the game. But halberds are a good addition for a tier 1 unit. That means they can actually do some damage to armor and some heavily armored monster units. And then the second unit being added is called the Frostworm. So if you guys remember, the Norska actually had a unit that was called that. It was basically like a ice dragon, but they called it the Frostworm. But now that Norskan unit is being changed to be called the Chaos Frost Dragon, and then Kislev is getting the true Frostworm. So it's a flightless dragon beast. It's not really a dragon, but yeah, worm is another word for dragon, but yeah, just call the worm instead of a dragon. So it's a flightless beast, deadly in combat, scything claws, and a vicious tail. It is a unit, but also a mount for Katarin and Ice Witches, which is pretty good for a mount. Especially it's going to make them a lot speedier. I'm curious to whether it's going to have like physical resistance, because maybe it's like more of a glass cannon, since a lot of the Ice Witch themes are around that. Yeah, talking about it's going to be a mount for Katarin and Ice Witches. We already talked about that. There is a good picture of it. Pretty cool looking unit, in my opinion. So as far as where it places in the Kislevite roster, it's going to be a mid-tier monster that's going to be very, very quick for what size it has. They say that it's pretty comparable tier-wise to a War Hydra from the Dark Elves or a Stegodon from the Lizardmen. And talking about its abilities, yeah, we already know it's going to be fast, but then it has the Frostbite ability. So this is like similar to the Frostart Phoenix's. I can't remember if there's anything else in Kislev that has a Frostbite. I think the Elemental Bear also has that, but I'm not quite sure on that. But that's a pretty good effect, slowing enemies, and it usually lowers their melee attack, if I remember right. At least that does for the Frostart Phoenix, but I don't know where that will happen for here. We already talked about that it's going to be a mount for Katerin and the Ice Witch. Then the last piece of thing that they're talking about is the free LC that's going to be coming, besides Akold, who was the previous FLC. But now we're going to get the Ice Court sled for Katerin, which is something I've been really looking forward to. In all of her old lore and her model, she was carried by a chariot sled instead of bears, which I really didn't like the flanderization of bears in Kislev, because it just seemed like all of the only thing that they had consistent with Kislev was bears. So it's nice to see some of the more like Ice Switch and Kislev themed units rather than just the infantry and bear themes. It looks pretty cool. Talking about its role in the battlefield, it's going to be the quickest way for Katerin to move around the battlefield. They already said that the Frost Worm will be pretty fast, so I wonder what the speed for the sled is going to be. So it's basically a chariot. Chariots aren't super effective without a whole lot of micro, so we'll see how strong this is. But it is going to be a ranged chariot, so that has an Ice Guard crew, which is cool because they do magical attacks, magical missiles, I should say. And so that's a pretty good addition for the Ice Sled, actually. To have good missile shooting that actually do some damage. It is only for Katerin, which I kind of like having that exclusively for her. But that's basically it. Something down here that cool that they've done is kind of show the additions of all the content they're adding with Shadows of Change 2.0. Because really the DLC did need quite a bit more content than it came with originally. So this is all the stuff that was originally there in the first place. And they basically doubled everything, which is awesome. So we'll get 2 more legendary heroes, getting a whole bunch of monsters, and I'm really, really glad they're adding a lot of infantry units. That's something I was disappointed with Shadows of Change, is that we got a lot of monsters, but there weren't a whole lot of infantry units, which I think significantly changed the way a faction plays rather than monsters. Infantry, missile units changed how you play it a lot more. So that's going to be it for this little blog reading. Just remember that the update releases next Thursday on the 22nd of February, and I'm really excited for this. Let me know what you guys think. But I'm Warhammer, and I'll talk to you guys next time.